Hey everyone, today we're diving into the interesting world of the Dacians. You might be wondering, who were these ancient people, and why are they so important in history? Well, the Dacians were an ancient group of Indo-European people who lived in a region known as Dacia. This area is near the Carpathian Mountains and west of the Black Sea, covering parts of what we now call Romania and Moldova, along with pieces of Ukraine, Serbia, Bulgaria, and even Hungary. So, they had quite a reach. The Dacians are often considered part of the larger Thracian group, but they definitely had their own unique culture. What's interesting is that their language, the Dacian language, might have been closely related to the Thracian language, though there's still some debate on that. They were also influenced by their neighbors, like the Scythians, and even the Celtic tribes who invaded around the 4th century BC. Now, let's talk names. The Dacians were known by a few different ones depending on where you're looking in history. In ancient Greek writings, they were called the Geti, while in Roman texts, they were referred to as the Daci. So, yeah, things can get a bit confusing because the terms Geti and Dacians were sometimes used interchangeably, especially by the Greeks. Even famous Roman writers like Julius Caesar and Pliny the Elder called them Dacians, and the poetic term, Geti, was still used here and there. Speaking of names, there's a pretty cool story behind where the name Dacians might come from. One theory says it's linked to the word, wolf, which has led some historians to believe that the Dacians might have had a strong connection with wolves, possibly even considering them sacred. This theory gets even more interesting when you learn that the Dacians had a military standard called the Draco, which featured a wolf's head. Pretty fierce, right? Alright, so the Dacians were a powerful force in their region. By the time the Romans were paying attention to them, most of the people living in what is now Romania were known as Dacians. They had their own distinct identity, but they weren't isolated. They were in contact with Celts, Germans, and other groups who crossed through their territory. So, north of the Danube River, the Dacians occupied an even larger area than what was once Ptolemaic Dacia. This extended from the Bohemian region in the west all the way to the Dnieper cataracts in the east, pushing further north up to the Pripyat, Vistula, and Oder rivers. Now this was a massive territory. In 53 BC, Julius Caesar himself made mention of the Dacians living at the eastern boundary of the Hercynian forest. This means they were right on the doorstep of Roman territory, which eventually made them a prime target for Roman expansion. But interestingly, it wasn't just the Dacians occupying this vast land. Other groups like the Geti, who were often considered the same people as the Dacians, were present as well. Both these groups were likely speaking a variation of the Thracian language, further solidifying their shared cultural roots. According to the ancient writer Strabo, the Geti lived closer to the east, while the Dacians controlled the western parts. When we dive into the language of the Dacians, things get a bit murky. The language they spoke has largely disappeared, leaving only place names, plant names, and personal names as clues. Some scholars believe it was closely related to Thracian, while others argue they were distinct languages altogether. Even now, there's no firm consensus on how different Dacian and Thracian were, but one thing's clear, they were both part of the Satem group of Indo-European languages. This means their speech would have shared some similar shifts in sounds. As for the cultural reach of the Dacians, it was quite extensive. They weren't just limited to the north of the Danube. Some Dacians lived on the southern side too. The Romans eventually clashed with these people, leading to the famous Dacian Wars under Emperor Trajan, which we'll explore in more detail later. Sarmizegetusa was the political and spiritual heart of the Dacian world. Nestled high in the mountains of modern-day Romania, this fortress city was their center of power. It's from here that Dacian leaders like King Decebalus challenged Rome, creating one of the most famous conflicts of the ancient world. And while many Dacian cities and towns used the suffix deva, which marked them as distinct, the Thracians to the south preferred para for their towns, highlighting some linguistic differences between the groups. But it wasn't just the Dacians who lived in this expansive region. Germanic and Celtic tribes also settled in parts of Dacia, especially in the north and northwest. This created a melting pot of different cultural influences in the area, with the Dacians absorbing and influencing neighboring tribes. After the Roman conquest, the cultural mix only intensified, especially with the introduction of Roman colonists. The true Dacians were resilient, and even after the Romans took over part of their territory, they kept rebelling, trying to throw off Roman rule. In fact, there were multiple uprisings even after Trajan's victory, proving that the spirit of resistance ran deep in Dacian society. And, in the absence of written records by the Dacians themselves, much of what we know comes from the remains of their material culture. By the Bronze Age, the ethnic groups in this region had begun to evolve, drawing on both local and Indo-European influences, especially from the steppes and Pontic areas. Now, by around 1200 BC, many Thracian groups hadn't yet fully separated, but we do see striking similarities between ceramics from Troy and those from the Carpathian area. Fast forward to about 1000 BC, the Carpatho-Danubian region was inhabited by a northern branch of the Thracians, who were advancing rapidly towards an Iron Age civilization. The arrival of the Scythians around 700 BC halted some of their connections with the West. Yet, from around 500 BC, the Dacians had developed their own distinct civilization, which later supported powerful centralized kingdoms by the 1st century BC and AD. Greek historian Herodotus gives us one of the earliest accounts of the Geti, often considered part of the Thracians, though they stood out due to their unique religious practices. While Roman sources first mention the term Dacians, it's clear that classical authors believed the Dacians were a branch of the Geti. According to Strabo, the Dacians lived more inland, toward the Pannonian Plain, while the Geti were closer to the Black Sea. Despite their close kinship with other Thracians, there were subtle differences between the groups, particularly in customs and religious practices. Some ancient sources even confused the Dacians with neighboring Scythians, though these differences are faint. Interestingly, some linguists argue that the Dacians might not have been directly related to the southern Thracians based on toponymic evidence in areas like southern Bulgaria. Additionally, there were historical theories that tied both the Geti Dacians and the Besso-Thracians to ancient Iranian peoples, although their languages retained characteristics that set them apart. As the Dacians moved forward in history, they came into contact with the Celts. By the 4th century BC, Celtic cultural influence began appearing in the archaeological record of Dacia, particularly in their burials. However, despite this interaction, the Dacians remained uniquely themselves, absorbing some Celtic elements but staying true to their own cultural identity. After Burebista, one of the most powerful Dacian kings, defeated the Celtic Boy tribe, the Dacians solidified their control over the region. Some scholars believe the Celts were driven out, while others think they simply merged into the Dacian population. These complex interactions between the Dacians and neighboring peoples, including the Celts and Scythians, show us how fluid cultural and political borders were in ancient times. So, as the Goths moved into southern Ukraine by 230 AD, they began pushing down the Black Sea coast, eventually claiming lands around the lower Danube. This led to clashes with local Dacian-speaking tribes, particularly the Carpi, who had long been a significant force in the region. The Goths, along with various other groups like the Vandals and Sarmatians, formed loose coalitions. However, by 248 AD, the Goths had taken the lead, dominating this alliance. The Carpi, often referred to as the Free Dacians, faced increasing pressure, squeezed between the advancing Goths and the Roman Empire's Dacian province. By 275 AD, Roman Emperor Aurelian decided it was time to give up the province of Dacia, effectively handing control of the region to both the Carpi and the Goths. Over time, the Goths steadily grew in power, taking over Dacian lands and reducing the influence of the Carpi. Fast forward to the 4th century, and the Gothic presence in the region only intensified. By the year 330 AD, Gothic groups, like the Thervingi, even considered moving further west toward the middle Danube. Many of them eventually sought refuge within the Roman Empire itself, settling in pockets, while others remained isolated from broader Roman influence. Despite the gradual collapse of Roman authority in Dacia, it's clear the Dacian identity didn't fade overnight. Dacian kingdoms and confederations still popped up, often as military alliances united by powerful kings like Burebista, who, back in the 1st century BC, had been a major force to reckon with. He ruled a large kingdom stretching from modern-day Romania into parts of Bulgaria and beyond. His capital, Sarmizegetusa, became a powerful hub, and under his rule, Dacia was formidable enough to be a significant threat to Rome. But of course, not everything was smooth for the Dacians. After Burebista's death, Dacia fell into a period of disunity, and while they occasionally attacked the Roman borders, it wasn't until the reign of Decebalus, the last great Dacian king, that the Romans took serious notice again. His daring raids south of the Danube pushed Emperor Domitian to the brink, and it wasn't until Emperor Trajan decided to launch a full-scale invasion that Dacia's fate was sealed. Trajan's campaigns against Decebalus in the early 2nd century AD are the stuff of legend. After multiple battles, Trajan finally captured Sarmizegetusa, forcing Decebalus to take his own life rather than be paraded through Rome in defeat. This marked the end of the Dacian Kingdom, and Dacia became a Roman province, though it only lasted about 170 years before being abandoned by the empire due to increasing pressures from outside forces like the Goths and the Carpi. And even after Rome's retreat, Dacian and Gothic cultures left a lasting mark on the region. The land was never fully Romanized, and Dacia's story continued, blending with the migrating Germanic tribes and influencing the centuries to come.